Chapter 1 A Captive Returns, August 1754. Rebecca stood tiptoe on a bench inside Widow Tyler's cabin. More than 2 years had passed since the raid on her family's farm. She was now 12 years old and, as Widow Tyler was fond of saying, almost as tall as a woman grown. It was warm in the widow's cabin, and the room smelled like apple cider. A damp strand of hair dangled in Rebecca's face, but she couldn't brush it aside. Her hands were full of long strings of apple rings. She had peeled and cored a bushel of apples and sliced the apples into rings. Then she had set the rings out in the sun, and after they were partly dried, she had strung them onto heavy thread. Now the rings were ready for hanging. By standing on the bench, Rebecca could reach the broad rafters that supported the ceiling. She stretched as tall as she could and looped the string of apple rings along rafters near the cabin's wide fireplace. She carefully positioned the string so that the fire's heat would slowly dry the apples into leathery circles. When she was finished, puckered apple rings bobbed overhead like beads strung on a lady's necklace. Rebecca looked up at her work, and she remembered the rhyme her mother had taught her years before. If you dry your apples in the fall, when winter comes, there'll be pie for all. I wonder where Mama is now, she thought with a stab of sorrow. Or Papa, or baby Benjamin. Are they alive, or... Rebecca bit her lip. There's no time for such thoughts, she reminded herself. I must get things ready so we don't go hungry this winter. She stirred the bean soup that was simmering on the fire and wondered what to do next. Should she braid the onions and hang them in the loft where she and Celinda slept? Should she pickle the cucumbers? She glanced over at Widow Tyler, who was sleeping in her chair. She wished the widow would wake up and advise her about what chores should be done first. But the widow had been ill, and she slept deeply. A quilt had fallen from her lap, and it lay bunched on the cabin's floor. Rebecca leaned down and picked up the quilt. She noticed it was stained. I'll wash it soon, she promised herself. She folded it neatly, and then put it on top of the wooden trunk where the widow kept her clothes and blankets. As Rebecca stood up, she glanced out the front window. It opened into the middle of Fort No. 4, a small guarded village of about 180 colonists. The families of the fort had built their wooden cabins and lean-tos around a central public square called the yard. The homes were built side by side so there were no gaps between them, and each building offered protection to its neighbors. A grassy area lay behind the cabins on the east, west, and north sides of the fort. The settlers used this area for woodpiles, outhouses, small gardens, and laundry set out to dry. And if you guys don't know, an outhouse was a outside bathroom, sort of like a porta potty, but built into the ground because they didn't have inside plumbing. Just beyond the grassy area, a tall palisade stood as a fence between the fort and the wilderness. The palisade was made of logs, each over 14 feet high, that stood upright in the ground about 4 to 5 inches apart. They were close enough together so that attackers could not pass between them, but far enough apart so that if attackers set one log on fire, the flames would not spread easily to the next log. On the south side of the fort, the great chamber stood above the south gate. In times of peace, the settlers held church services and town councils in the great chamber. In times of war, the chamber was a barracks for soldiers, and muskets boomed from its narrow windows. A tall watchtower rose up from one side of the great chamber. It overlooked the fort and the surrounding countryside. Beneath the watchtower, soldiers guarded the south gate, the fort's only entrance. Ever since the raid, Rebecca and Celinda had lived inside the fort with Widow Tyler, who had kindly offered to share her home with the sisters. The widow was a poor woman who did sewing for other settlers. Under the widow's teaching, Celinda had become a very good seamstress. Because she was lame, the result of a broken leg that had never healed quite right, Celinda did not mind sitting quietly for hours at a time. She would work patiently on a dress until it was perfect. And lame was someone whose leg didn't work, who couldn't walk properly. Rebecca had little of her sister's patience, but she was strong and willing to work hard. She cleaned, cooked, and did chores for the widow and other families who needed occasional help. By working together, she, Celinda, and the widow had earned enough money to survive during their first year together. Last spring, however, the widow had become ill, and she'd had to give up her sewing. Since then, Rebecca had spent most of her time nursing the widow and taking care of the house. 11-year-old Celinda had been hired out to work for the Cutters, a family from Connecticut who had recently moved to the fort. In the evening, Celinda helped Rebecca with chores at home. At least Celinda and I still have each other, Rebecca thought, as she looked out the window to the warm sunshine outside. On this bright August day, the fort's yard was filled with activity. Women in work dresses hurried about their errands. Men, armed with muskets, talked and traded, and a gang of little children screeched and shouted in a noisy game of blindman's buff. Rebecca wished with all her heart that she could be outside too, but she knew she had chores to do. I'd best be starting on the pickle, she decided. With a grimace, she remembered how much she hated the sour smell of the pickling vinegar. She sighed and was about to return back to her work when she caught sight of her sister. Celinda was crossing the yard with her arms full of quilts. 15-year-old Ezekiel Cutter walked ahead of Celinda. They were making their way toward the south gate. Rebecca realized they must be headed down to the river to do washing. I could go with them and wash the widow's quilt, Rebecca thought. It would be so pleasant to step into the cool river. She glanced at Widow Tyler. The old woman was still asleep. I'll do the pickles later, Rebecca decided. She grabbed the stained quilt and hurried outside. Celinda, tarry a moment. I'll go with you. Rebecca ran across the yard, the baked ground feeling hot under her bare feet. When she reached her sister, she was surprised to see that Celinda looked pale, and that her eyes were red from crying. What troubles you? Rebecca asked breathlessly. Celinda looked up sadly. Both girls were slender, with walnut-brown eyes and curly dark brown hair. But while Rebecca had grown tall, Celinda was frail and small for her age. Oh, Becca, Celinda began. She stopped as Ezekiel turned and walked toward them. He was a tall, broad-shouldered boy with red hair and a jaw that jutted out like a bulldog's. Although he was too young to be a soldier, he liked to think of himself as a tough Indian fighter. He wore his long hunting knife in a leather sheath, and he carried his musket proudly. I'll tell you later, when we're alone, Celinda whispered. Can't you hurry? Ezekiel demanded, staring at Celinda. I have better things to do than stand watch over a servant girl. I'm going with you to the river, Rebecca announced. Ezekiel was about to protest, so she continued. I can help Celinda, and we'll be safer if we all go together. Oh, very well, Ezekiel agreed reluctantly. But don't keep me waiting. He walked ahead, leaving the girls to follow. Yes, your majesty, Rebecca muttered behind his back. She turned to her sister. Here, I'll carry one of those, she said, and took one of the two quilts from Celinda's arms. They crossed the yard and passed under the south gate. Be careful out there, cautioned the sentry, a young private named Jacob Chandler. You know what folks have been saying. Rebecca felt herself tighten with anxiety. Since the attack on the Percy's farm, Fort No. 4 had enjoyed a relatively peaceful period. Yet recently there had been growing rumors that the French and Indians were once again preparing to attack. Fort No. 4's location made it a target for Indian raids. The small fort was isolated on the edge of the New England colonies. To the north of the fort lay vast miles of forest, rivers, and mountains controlled by the Indians and their French allies in Canada. To the south, the next closest English fort was 50 miles away. There was no road between the forts. English colonists traveled between the two outposts either by canoe or by forest trails. Either way, it was a dangerous journey. If I see a savage, I'll shoot him dead, Ezekiel bragged. Well, said Private Chandler, I wouldn't want to be the one to tell Miss Priscilla that something had happened to you. Priscilla was Ezekiel's blue-eyed older sister. She was thought by many people, including Private Chandler, to be the prettiest girl in the fort. Keep your eyes open, the private warned. Ezekiel led the way through the gate, with Rebecca and Celinda following close behind. They left the safety of the high palisade behind and started down the trail to the Connecticut River, less than half a mile away. The well-worn path led across the wide meadows and then through the woods. Rebecca breathed deeply as she walked through the meadows. She loved the smell of flowers, and all around her were graceful goldenrod, cheerful black-eyed Susans, and delicate Queen Anne's lace. Honeybees darted among the blossoms. Rebecca spied some blackberry bushes near the trail. Their thorny branches were dotted with ripe, luscious-looking fruit. Rebecca stopped for a moment and shifted the quilts to her left arm. She quickly picked as many of the berries as she could hold in her right hand. She ate a few of the juicy, slightly tart berries, then offered some to Celinda. The younger girl shook her head. Oh, I forgot, Rebecca said, recalling the berries gave her sister a rash. I'm sorry. She was about to eat the remaining berries herself when Ezekiel grabbed them from her hand. I'll take those, he said, and stuffed the berries in his mouth. Juice dribbled down his chin. Those were mine, Rebecca protested. Ezekiel smiled meanly. Now they're mine, he said. He scanned the late afternoon sky. Hurry up. We've only a few more hours of light left, and you girls have been going slower than molasses in January. Rebecca looked up at him defiantly. We'd go quicker if you'd carry one of these, she said, holding out the two big quilts in her arms. And besides... Wait! Celinda grabbed her sister's hand. Someone's coming! Rebecca and Ezekiel whirled around. Rebecca caught her breath. A man on horseback was galloping toward them. Ezekiel reached for his musket. Don't shoot! A hoarse voice shouted. It's me, old Johnny! Rebecca breathed easily again. All the fort's residents knew old Johnny. He was a peddler who traveled to settlements throughout the New England colonies. Every few months he visited Fort No. 4 to trade, drink rum, and share the latest news. Ezekiel lowered his musket. Didn't know it was you, Johnny. We don't get many visitors. Johnny pulled his horse up in front of them. He was a small, thin man with an overgrown beard. You'll get more visitors soon, he rasped. I met up with Captain Stevens and his men a few hours ago. Captain Stevens? Rebecca and Celinda exchanged excited glances. Both girls had the same thought. Maybe he has news for us. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony had sent Captain Stevens to Canada to ransom English captives being held in Montreal. The captain had been chosen for the mission because he himself was a former Indian captive. The Abenakis had captured him when he was in his teens, and he had learned their language and customs. After he was ransomed, the captain had returned to the English colonies. He had become a leader who was respected for his courage and his knowledge of the Indians. Now everyone in the fort was eager for the captain's return from his latest mission, especially the Percy sisters. When's the captain getting here, Johnny? Ezekiel asked. The peddler shrugged. He said he'd be home by sunset today, but first he was going to parley with some Indians he'd heard was nearby. The peddler wiped his chin with a dirty sleeve. I figured I'd come ahead to the fort and have a drink or two. Does Captain Stevens have anyone with him? Any captives? Rebecca asked eagerly. Johnny nodded. Aye, he does. Celinda squeezed her sister's hand. Is it a man and a woman? With a little boy? She asked, her eyes bright with hope. Nay, said Johnny. Just a boy, and he's about 14 or so. He's been with the Abenakis most of his life, and from what I heard tell, he weren't too keen on leaving them either. He might have seen Mama or Papa in the Indian village, Celinda said hopefully. He might know where they are. The peddler shrugged. The captain ought to reach the fort soon. You can ask the boy yourself then, if he'll tell you. Farewell. He snapped his horse's reins and rode off. Ezekiel motioned to the girls to hurry. 'Tisn't safe out here. Make haste. With Ezekiel in the lead, they proceeded single file down the trail. The path led through the woods, then dipped down a steep embankment to the river. Rebecca was filled with excitement. She could hardly wait to talk with Captain Stevens. When they reached the water's edge, Ezekiel pointed toward a tree. I'll be there. Holler if you see anything. And work quick. Rebecca tucked up the hem of her homespun petticoat and waded out into the river. The chilly water lapped against her bare legs. She splashed a little on her flushed face and felt a cooling trickle down her back. Get to work! Ezekiel shouted from a shady perch. Rebecca glared at him. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started pounding the quilts against the stones along the river bank. Ezekiel angers me so, she told Celinda in a low tone. But 'tis exciting about the captain's return, is it not? For a moment Celinda said nothing. Rebecca glanced up from the quilts and saw tears welling in her sister's eyes. What ails you? Tell me. 'Tis the Cutter, Celinda said at last. They've decided to move back to Connecticut. Mrs. Cutter says it's too dangerous here. They plan to leave a week from Friday. Rebecca was relieved. Ah, is that it? Well, I never gave a fig for the Cutters anyhow. Ezekiel is a bully, and his sister Priscilla is vainer than a peacock. She keeps you sewing all day so she can swish around the fort looking pretty. Rebecca gave the Cutter's quilt an extra hard pounding. Don't fret, we'll find you work somewhere else. You don't understand, protested Celinda. I must go too. What? Rebecca was so startled that she dropped the quilt. It splashed into the water. What do you mean? Mrs. Cutter says I'm indentured to her, so I must leave with them. But we had an agreement, Rebecca exclaimed. When you were hired out to them, Mrs. Cutter said you'd only work for them during the day, and you and I could still live together at the widow's. She promised. Now Mrs. Cutter says everything's changed because they're moving. She says she paid for a year of my service, and by law I'm bound to give it. Celinda looked up at her sister. Oh, Becca, Connecticut's so far. If they take me there, I might never see you again. She paused and her face crumpled into tears. And what if Mamma and Papa come back? And I'm gone. Rebecca felt shaken. Neither she nor Celinda could remember ever traveling more than a few miles from Fort Number 4, much less all the way to Connecticut. How could Mrs. Cutter take Celinda away? The two sisters had never spent even a night apart. Would Mrs. Cutter really separate them? Maybe forever? Suddenly, all the beauty of the late summer day vanished for Rebecca. Despite the hot sun, she felt cold all over. But she saw Celinda looking up at her with worried eyes. Rebecca tried to smile. We'll think of something, she promised as she pounded the wet wool on the rocks. We'll ask Captain Stevens for help. Don't worry. By the time they arrived back at the fort, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees. The sentry told them that Captain Stevens had been sighted off in the distance, about half an hour's ride away. Rebecca and Celinda quickly set the quilts out to dry in the grassy area behind the cabins. Then they hurried to join the excited crowd of settlers who were gathered in the yard. Soon the loud crack of muskets split the air. Huzzah! Welcome back, the settlers shouted as the captain and his soldiers rode in through the south gate. A lean, darkly tanned boy followed close behind the soldiers. Rebecca knew he must be the former captive. She watched him eagerly. He rode his big horse with careless grace, his bare feet dangling outside the stirrups. He had greasy brown hair that hung down past his shoulders, and his face was smudged with dirt. His clothes, an oversized homespun shirt and baggy breeches, looked as if they were cast-offs from the soldiers. The soldiers waved and shouted greetings to their friends and family. The boy ignored the hubbub around him. He stared straight ahead, expressionless. Rebecca's heart fell as she watched the boy. He doesn't look like a real white boy at all, she thought. He looks like an Indian in a white man's skin. Behind her she heard Ezekiel spit on the hard-packed earth. That one's trouble, he muttered darkly. Mark my words.